I had been driving long-haul routes for over a decade, and I thought I had seen everything the road had to offer: accidents, oddballs, even the occasional paranormal story traded among truckers at rest stops. But what happened to me on a remote stretch of road in the Appalachian Mountains still haunts me to this day. It started as just another job. I was running a load of industrial equipment from Pennsylvania to Kentucky, a straightforward drive with a tight deadline. I preferred driving at night, less traffic, fewer distractions. The roads were empty, just me and the occasional glow of distant headlights breaking the darkness. Somewhere around 2 a.m., my GPS warned me of a road closure ahead. Construction was common on these old highways, so I didn't think much of it. I followed the detour it suggested, turning onto a smaller, winding road that snaked through the dense, tree-covered mountains. That's when things started to feel off. The road was too narrow for comfort. It twisted sharply, and the further I went, the worse it became. The asphalt looked cracked and worn, like it hadn't been maintained in years. There were no other vehicles, no streetlights, and no signs of civilization. Just miles of forest pressing in from both sides. The deeper I went, the more I had the unsettling sensation that I was driving into a place I wasn't meant to be. I thought about turning around, but the road was too tight to make a safe U-turn. I figured I'd just push through until I hit a main highway again. Then, after another sharp bend, I saw it. The entrance appeared suddenly. One moment, there was nothing but trees, and the next, my headlights illuminated the gaping black maw of an unmarked tunnel cut into the mountainside. I tapped the brakes, hesitating. There was something wrong about it. The tunnel's concrete was aged and cracked, covered in a film of moss and grime. Faint graffiti lined the edges, the letters worn away by time. But what unsettled me the most was the absolute absence of signage. No clearance warnings, no name, no indication that this was a functional passageway. I pulled up my GPS again. The detour still insisted this was the right way, but something about the tunnel made my instincts scream at me to turn back. Unfortunately, I had no choice. There was no way to turn around, and reversing for miles on a narrow, twisting road in the dark wasn't an option. I exhaled slowly and pressed forward. As soon as I entered, my headlights barely cut through the darkness. The walls were damp, cracked, and riddled with jagged patches where pieces had crumbled away. The air inside felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. The tunnel went on far longer than I expected. Most tunnels like this were a few hundred feet, maybe half a mile at most. But after what felt like several minutes of driving, there was still no end in sight. The darkness seemed to stretch infinitely ahead of me. Then, my CB radio crackled to life with static. A low whisper came through, barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at the CB unit, hoping I had imagined it, but the static continued to hum softly, like something breathing through the speaker. Then the truck died. Everything cut off at once. Engine, lights, dashboard. Even my phone screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I tried turning the key. Nothing. Not even the clicking sound of a failing ignition. The truck was completely dead. I reached for my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, my boots echoing against the tunnel's walls. The air was cold, damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and something rotting. I moved to the front of the truck, shining my light ahead. The tunnel stretched on, black and endless, the beam of my flashlight swallowed by the darkness. Then I heard it. A knock. Slow, deliberate. Coming from inside the trailer. I whipped around, my heart in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time. I swallowed hard and backed toward the cab, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. I had locked the trailer before I left the last stop. There was no way anyone had gotten in. But as I stood there, paralyzed, I realized something chilling. The knocks weren't random. They were rhythmic. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more knocks. Something, or someone was following a pattern. Then came the scraping. A long, slow drag of something sharp along the metal walls of the trailer. It started at the back and worked its way forward, the sound sending ice down my spine. I needed to get out of there. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled to start the truck again, my breath coming out in short, frantic gasps. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the side mirror. Something was crawling along the tunnel wall. Not walking, crawling. Its limbs bent wrong, its fingers elongated, splayed out against the concrete like a spider clinging to a surface it shouldn't be able to grip. The flashlight beam barely caught its form, but I could see its eyes, reflective, like an animal's, staring straight at me. Then it smiled. I slammed my fist against the dashboard. Start, damn it. And then, as if the truck itself had sensed the urgency, the engine roared back to life. The headlights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw it fully. Pale, almost translucent skin. A body too thin, too elongated. Its mouth stretched too wide, lips curling back over jagged, uneven teeth. It clung to the tunnel wall like it was weightless, its head cocked unnaturally to the side as it watched me. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. The engine roared, tires screeching as I tore through the tunnel at full speed. I refused to look in the mirrors. I knew it was behind me. I could feel it. Then, suddenly, I burst out into open air. The tunnel spat me onto a familiar highway. Bright green exit signs glowed in the distance, the world feeling normal again. I checked my GPS. It showed me on the original highway, as if I had never taken the detour at all. I glanced at my mirrors. The tunnel was gone. Just open road behind me. I kept driving. I didn't stop until I was 100 miles away, where I pulled into a rest stop and sat in my cab, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. I asked a few other truckers if they knew of an unmarked tunnel in the Appalachians. None of them did. To this day, I don't know where I went that night, or what I saw in that tunnel. But sometimes, when I'm on a long haul through the mountains, my CB radio will crackle with static. And I swear, I hear a whisper. You shouldn't be here. I've been trucking for 15 years, long enough to know the road better than I know my own house. I've driven through every kind of weather, on every kind of road, across every stretch of this country. And in all those years, I've seen some strange things. Things that don't make sense, things I don't talk about. Because out here, on these lonely roads, sometimes you see something you can't explain, and it's best to keep driving. This happened in the dead of winter, somewhere in Wyoming. A long, empty stretch of highway cut through nothing but snow-covered plains and jagged hills. The kind of place where, if you broke down, you'd freeze before help arrived. I was hauling a load of auto parts, running late, pushing through the last hours of my shift. It was past midnight, and the road was deserted. Just me and the hum of my engine, my headlights cutting through the darkness. Then I saw him. A man, standing dead center in my lane. He was facing me motionless, his head slightly tilted. He didn't wave for help, didn't move a muscle, just stood there waiting. I had maybe 2 seconds to react. Instinct took over. I slammed the brakes, gripping the wheel hard as my rig screamed against the icy pavement. The weight of my haul made stopping damn near impossible, and I braced for the impact. But there was no impact. The truck shuddered to a halt, and I sat there, heart pounding, breath fogging up the cab. My high beams flooded the road ahead, but the man was gone. Just open highway, stretching into the darkness. I blinked, my hands shaking on the wheel. I knew what I saw. He was there. He had to be. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he ran off the road? Maybe I just imagined him. No, I knew he was real. I grabbed my flashlight, cracked open the door, and stepped out. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut. The wind howled across the empty plains, sending waves of powdery snow drifting over the asphalt. I scanned the road, my light cutting through the night. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. Just an endless stretch of lonely highway. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the truck, my gut screaming at me to get inside and go. But as I reached for the door, my CB crackled to life. It was static at first, broken and garbled. I froze, listening. Then, beneath the noise, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Heavy, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing into my ear. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The road was still empty. But that breathing, it was real. It was coming from the CB. I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors, my pulse hammering in my throat. I reached for the radio, ready to call for someone, anyone. Then, through the static, a voice, low, distorted, barely more than a whisper. You should have kept driving. My skin went ice cold. I grabbed the mic, my voice shaking. Who is this? No answer. Just more static, more breathing. Then silence. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to slow my heartbeat. I checked my mirrors, my headlights illuminating the snow-covered road behind me. Empty. I was alone. I don't know how long I sat there, staring out at the night. 5 minutes. 10. Eventually, I forced myself to take a deep breath and put the truck in gear. I wasn't about to sit around and wait to see what happened next. I rolled forward, my headlights carving through the darkness. The road stretched on, empty and endless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching, following. Every now and then, I glanced in my mirrors, half expecting to see something moving in the distance. The CB stayed silent. 2 hours later, I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town. I pulled in, parked, and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel. The lights of the truck stop felt safe, the warm glow a stark contrast to the empty highway. I finally climbed out, my legs stiff, my body aching. Inside, I ordered a coffee, barely tasting it as I stared out the window. The lot was quiet, a few other truckers scattered here and there. I thought about asking if anyone else had seen something on the road that night, but I didn't, because deep down, I already knew the answer. I finished my coffee, sat there a while longer, then got back in my rig and kept driving. And I never took that route again. I've been driving trucks for 15 years. You see a lot of weird things on the road, strange people, accidents, abandoned places, but nothing has ever stuck with me quite like what happened on a late-night haul through the Mojave Desert. To this day, I don't know what was in that trailer, and I don't want to know. It was a simple job. I was contracted to pick up a sealed trailer from a logistics hub in Barstow and drive it to a warehouse in Nevada. No hazmat, no live cargo, just a routine drop and hook. The paperwork listed the contents as construction materials. Nothing unusual, though I did notice one oddity. The trailer was locked up tight with an industrial seal, the kind you don't usually see unless it's something really valuable or classified. But hey, not my problem. My job was to drive, not ask questions. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only company I had was the occasional distant glow of another truck's taillights far ahead. The road was straight, the night clear, and I was making good time. Then I heard it. A thump. Subtle at first, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine and the steady whine of tires against asphalt. I figured it was just the cargo shifting. Even properly secured loads sometimes settle after a few miles. Then came another thump. Louder. Followed by a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy scraping against metal. I felt my stomach tighten. Cargo doesn't just move like that. It doesn't scrape. That sound, it was deliberate, intentional, like something inside was shifting on its own. I flicked on my interior cab light and glanced at my side mirrors. The trailer looked fine. The doors were locked, the seal unbroken. But the noises continued, thump, drag, scratch. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my CB radio and called in. Dispatch, this is Rig 248. I think I've got a loose load back here. Might need to pull over and check. Silence. Then a burst of static, followed by my dispatcher's voice. Negative 248. That trailer was sealed at pickup. Do not break the seal. Just keep driving. That didn't sit right with me. You sure? Because something's moving around back there. Could be a safety issue. A long pause. Then, in a lower voice, my dispatcher said, You don't want to open it. Trust me. Just keep driving. That was all I needed to hear. If even dispatch was telling me not to look inside, I wanted nothing to do with whatever was back there. So I did as I was told. I kept driving, but the noises didn't stop. Over the next hour, the sounds escalated. The thumps grew louder, more frantic. Sometimes it sounded like something slamming against the walls. Other times, it was that awful, dragging noise, like nails on a chalkboard but deeper, more guttural. I cranked up the radio to drown it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was back there knew I was up here. At one point, I glanced at my side mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. For the briefest second, I thought I saw movement. A shadowy shape, pressed up against the inside wall of the trailer, shifting unnaturally. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation, highway hypnosis, tricks of the light. But I kept my eyes on that mirror for the next 10 miles, just in case. Then, around 2:30 a.m., the worst happened. The trailer door banged. Not a little shuffle. Not a creak. Something hit it from the inside. Hard. My heart was pounding now. My mouth dry. I checked the mirror again, and this time, I swore I saw something. A handprint. pressed against the inside of the trailer's metal wall. That was it. I was done. I needed to stop. I pulled off at the next truck stop, my hands shaking as I put the rig in park. The second the engine cut off, the silence was deafening. I climbed out of the cab, my boots crunching on gravel, and made my way toward the back of the trailer. Every instinct was screaming at me not to do it. I hesitated, hand hovering over the latch. The industrial seal was still intact. Nothing should have been able to get in or out, but I knew what I'd heard. And then I smelled it. Rot, like something had died inside. The stench hit me in a wave, thick and rancid. I stumbled back, gagging. Nope, I wasn't doing this. I didn't care what was in there. I was locking the cab, getting some coffee, and waiting until sunrise to figure it out. But as I turned to walk away, I heard something from inside the trailer. A whisper, faint, muffled by the thick metal walls. Help me. I froze. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. Could it be a stowaway? Someone trapped? But why the sealed trailer? Why had dispatch warned me not to open it? I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I took a breath. I think there's someone locked in my trailer. Can you confirm that, sir? I heard them. They're whispering. The trailer was sealed, but a bang interrupted me, so loud it made me jump. The whole trailer shuddered as if something inside was throwing itself against the walls. Then came a noise I will never forget. Not human, not animal, something in between. A wet, gurgling snarl, filled with something primal, something wrong. My breath hitched. My vision blurred at the edges. Then all at once, the noises stopped. Total silence. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed to vanish. The dispatcher was still talking in my ear, but I barely heard them. My body was in full fight-or-flight mode. I don't remember getting back in my truck. I don't remember starting the engine or getting back on the road. The next thing I knew, I was 50 miles down the highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart slamming in my chest. I never stopped again. When I reached my destination in Nevada, I dropped the trailer and left without speaking to anyone. I didn't wait for unloading. I didn't check my mirrors. I just left. A few days later, I got a message from dispatch. Simple. Ominous. Good job. Don't ask questions. I never did. But sometimes when I'm parked alone at a rest stop, in the middle of nowhere, I swear I still hear it. That faint, dragging sound. And a whisper on the wind. Help me. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years. I've driven across every state, crossed through endless miles of flatlands, deserts, and snow-covered highways. I've seen some things that don't make sense, things I don't talk about much, but nothing has ever stuck with me the way that night in Texas did. It was late, pushing past 2 a.m., and I was somewhere along a lonely stretch of State Highway 21. It was one of those roads where the trees crowd the edges, their twisted branches forming a tunnel of darkness beyond the reach of my high beams. The occasional reflector on the pavement was the only thing keeping me from feeling completely alone in the void. I was making good time, hauling a load of auto parts to a depot in Houston. It was an easy route, no complicated turns, no mountains, just open road. But as the miles stretched on, a strange unease settled in my gut. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Truckers know that fatigue can play tricks on the mind. Shadows turn into figures, the hum of tires against asphalt morphs into whispers. I knew better than to let it get to me. Then I saw her, a woman walking along the shoulder of the road. She was barefoot, dressed in a long, white gown that clung to her like it was soaked. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and her head tilted downward, her face obscured by tangled, wet hair. She didn't even flinch as my headlights washed over her. Didn't look up, didn't react at all. Now, I've seen plenty of hitchhikers and drifters on these long hauls, and I never pick them up. It's an unspoken rule. Don't stop for anyone, especially not in the dead of night. But something about her sent a chill straight through me. As I passed her, I checked my side mirror. She was still there, just standing motionless, the glow of my taillights stretching her shadow into something impossibly long. I shivered, forced my eyes back to the road, and tried to shake it off. Probably some poor girl who'd run away from a bad situation. Maybe her car broke down. Maybe she was lost. But then, just a few minutes later, there she was again, standing on the shoulder, ahead of me. I slammed on my brakes so hard my tires screeched against the pavement. My hands tightened around the wheel, my pulse thudding in my ears. How the hell was she in front of me? I hadn't seen another car pass. No side roads, no turnoffs, just endless stretches of highway and thick forest pressing in on both sides. I checked my mirrors again. She was still behind me, but she was also ahead. The air in my cab felt suddenly thick, suffocating. My radio crackled to life, static hissing through the silence. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep driving, to push past her. I told myself it was just a trick of the road, maybe two different people wearing similar clothes, or maybe my tired eyes playing games with me. But deep down, I knew better. As I passed her the second time, I refused to look, kept my gaze locked forward, fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I pressed harder on the gas, my truck roaring against the night. And then I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road. I barely had time to react. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, my tires screaming as I fought to keep control. The truck shuddered, nearly jackknifing as I swerved around her. For a split second, my headlights caught her face. It was wrong. Her eyes were too dark, too deep, like empty sockets that swallowed the light. Her mouth hung open, but there was nothing inside, just a hollow void where a throat should have been. And her skin, so pale it was almost translucent, seemed to shimmer like it wasn't fully there. Then she was gone, just vanished. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept my foot on the pedal, speeding down that cursed road like the devil himself was on my tail. The radio crackled again. This time, a voice, soft and hollow, whispered through the static. "You shouldn't have seen me." I nearly drove off the road. My hands were shaking, my skin ice cold despite the sweat dripping down my neck. I reached out and twisted the dial, trying to cut off the sound, but the voice persisted. "You shouldn't have seen me." I killed the radio completely. The silence was almost worse. By the time I saw lights ahead, I was nearly hyperventilating. A gas station. Small, run down, but blessedly real. I pulled in hard, tires kicking up dust, and threw the truck into park. The attendant was an older man, leaning against the counter, barely looking up as I stumbled inside. "Rough night?" he asked, not even surprised by my pale face and shaking hands. I hesitated, debating whether I should say anything, but something told me he knew. I saw someone on the road." My voice came out hoarse, my throat dry as sandpaper. A woman, white dress, kept appearing ahead of me. The old man sighed, closed his eyes like he'd heard it before. "You're not the first trucker to see her," he said, "but the ones who stopped. They never made it out of these woods." A heavy silence settled between us. My stomach twisted into knots. "Whatever you do," he added, voice low, "don't look for her in your mirrors." A cold dread slithered down my spine. I paid for my gas, grabbed a coffee, and got back in my truck. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. Before pulling out, I forced myself to look straight ahead. Not in the side mirrors. Not in the rear view. I didn't see her again that night. But as I drove away, I swear I felt it. A presence in the sleeper behind me. Breathing. Watching. And I never looked back. I've been driving long haul for almost 20 years now. I've seen just about everything you can imagine. Drunks wandering onto highways, animals darting out of the woods, wrecks that make your stomach turn. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever made my skin crawl like what happened that night on I-90 in Montana. I had picked up a refrigerated load in Washington and was headed to Minnesota. It was a long trip, but I'd done it plenty of times. This particular stretch of I-90 was one of the loneliest roads in the country. Miles of nothing but rolling plains and darkness. Towns were sparse, truck stops even more so. It was the kind of road that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. It was just past midnight when I saw him. A man stood on the side of the road, his thumb sticking out in that universal hitchhiker gesture. He was tall, thin, and wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. His jeans looked old and worn, and he had a backpack slung over one shoulder. Something about him made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still, too rigid. Maybe it was the fact that he wasn't looking at me, just facing forward, as if he already knew I was going to stop. I had a strict rule: never pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories. But something about this guy made me hesitate. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just the eerie stillness of the road that made me crave some kind of human presence. Against my better judgment, I slowed down, the hiss of my air brakes cutting through the silence. He didn't move at first, just stood there. Then, without looking up, he walked toward my cab and climbed in. The smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic like blood, hit me immediately. I forced a smile. "Where you headed?" He didn't answer right away. Just sat there, breathing heavy. Then, finally, in a low, scratchy voice, he muttered, "Just a bit further." I didn't like that answer. It was vague, non-committal. But I wasn't about to press him. Something about the way he said it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I pulled back onto the highway, trying to focus on the road, but I could feel his presence next to me like a weight. He was staring straight ahead, never blinking, his hood still up. I tried to make conversation to shake the nerves. "Rough night?" I asked. Silence. I cleared my throat. Not many folks out this late. Again, nothing. His breathing was steady but off. It was like he was whispering to himself under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, just a low muttering sound. I told myself it was just some weird quirk. Maybe he was cold or tired. Maybe he was just one of those loners who preferred silence. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. 5 miles passed. Then 10. The whole time, he never moved. Just sat there, muttering to himself in that strange, raspy whisper. I stole a glance at him. His hands were resting on his lap, fingers twitching slightly. His nails were dirty, caked with something dark. Dried blood? My stomach twisted. I gripped the wheel tighter. "How far you going?" No answer. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Something wasn't right. I'd spent years learning to trust my gut, and right now, it was screaming at me. I made up my mind. I wasn't taking this guy any further. I spotted an upcoming rest area sign, 2 miles ahead. Good enough. I wasn't going to leave him in the middle of nowhere, but I'd drop him off there and let him figure out the rest. "Hey," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. "I got a pullover up ahead. You can hop out there." No response. Just that steady breathing. And then, ever so slightly, he turned his head toward me. It was the first time he moved since getting in, and it nearly made me slam on the brakes. His face was still mostly hidden by the hood, but I could see his mouth moving, lips forming words I couldn't hear. Then, in the dim light of the dashboard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His teeth. Too many of them. Too sharp. Like a row of jagged needles lining his mouth. I felt my throat close up. My hands tightened on the wheel. I didn't know what the hell I had just seen, but I knew I had to get him out of my truck. The rest stop came into view, a dimly lit parking area with a few vending machines and nothing else. I pulled in, my hands slick with sweat. "This is where you get off," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move. I turned to look at him, and that's when I realized. The passenger door was already open, and he was gone, but I never heard it open, never felt the shift in weight as he left. The seat was empty, but the door still hung wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside, half expecting to see him standing there in the dark. But there was nothing, just the empty parking lot and the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. I shut the door and locked it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. That's when the CB radio crackled to life. A low, static-filled voice whispered through the speaker. "Thanks for the ride." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed the radio and switched channels, but the voice was gone. Just dead air. I didn't sleep that night. I just drove, refusing to stop until the sun rose. I never picked up a hitchhiker again, and I never forgot the sound of that voice. My shift starts before the world wakes up. I work for a trash company in rural Pennsylvania, and in the summer, my days begin as early as 2 a.m. It's a lonely job. By the time most people roll out of bed, I've already driven miles of empty roads, picked up tons of waste, and watched the sunrise in my rearview mirror. It was a humid July morning last year, around 3 a.m. I was about an hour into my route, driving down a narrow backcountry road, the kind where trees press in from both sides, their branches stretching overhead to form a tunnel. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked pavement ahead. There were no streetlights out here, no houses nearby, just woods stretching for miles. The only sounds were the low rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional chirp of insects in the trees. I was cruising along at a steady pace when I saw something up ahead in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer resting, But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were sitting cross-legged in the center of the road, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, their face completely obscured. They weren't moving. I slowed to a crawl, my headlights washing over them, but they didn't react. They didn't look up, didn't flinch at the sound of my truck approaching. Just sat there, perfectly still. I honked the horn, nothing. Not even a twitch. I hit the air horn, the kind that could shake the windows of a house, but still they didn't move. The truck was less than 15 feet away now. I had half a mind to climb down and see if they needed help, but something about the whole thing felt off. This wasn't normal behavior. The air in the truck felt thick, like the temperature had risen a few degrees. I was suddenly aware of my own breathing, how heavy it sounded in the cab. My instincts screamed at me that something wasn't right. I sat there for maybe a minute, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The truck's headlights lit them up clear as day. Dark hoodie, sleeves pulled over their hands, legs crossed neatly, head slightly bowed. No reaction. No movement. Just sitting there. Then it hit me. Why the hell would anyone be sitting in the middle of the road at 3 a.m.? This wasn't some well-traveled highway. It was a forgotten strip of asphalt cutting through miles of dense forest. There was no reason for them to be here. I felt it then, the unmistakable pull of fear, cold and sharp in my gut. I threw the truck into reverse. The hiss of air brakes filled the cab as I backed up, my heart pounding. As I rolled backward, I kept my eyes on the figure, half expecting them to suddenly spring to life and charge at me. But they didn't move. They just sat there, unmoving, as I reversed further down the road. I didn't turn my back to them. I kept looking, watching, waiting for something, anything to happen. The truck's reverse lights cast long, pale shadows, stretching out over the pavement. The figure stayed still, eerily motionless in the glow of my headlights. Then, as I reached a bend in the road, they finally moved. Not in a way you'd expect. They didn't stand up, didn't wave, didn't shout after me. They just slowly tilted their head to the side, as if acknowledging that I was leaving, that they knew I was watching. That was enough for me. I slammed the truck into drive and got the hell out of there. For the next few miles, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see them running after me. But the road stayed empty. The woods were still. Nothing but darkness and the occasional glint of my taillights reflecting off the trees. I didn't call the cops. What would I even say? Hey, there was a guy sitting in the road, and he creeped me out. No crime had been committed. And honestly, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out if there was more to the story. By the time I reached the main highway, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I finished my route that morning with a tight feeling in my chest, my mind replaying that scene over and over. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Was it some messed up prank? A test to see how someone would react? Or something worse? I don't know. All I know is that I never took that road again. And I never will. Hitchhiking is always a gamble. You take a ride with a stranger and hope to make it to your destination in one piece. Back in 1999, when I was 18, I set out on a long trip, hitchhiking from Quebec City to Cochrane, Ontario, then back down to North Bay. I was a big kid, but still a kid, and I didn't realize just how risky it could be. That night, luck wasn't on my side. I walked for hours along the dark, empty highway, the only sounds my own footsteps and the distant rustling of trees in the wind. The occasional car passed, but no one stopped. Midnight had come and gone, and the exhaustion was setting in when I finally saw headlights slowing down ahead of me. A transport truck, massive and looming, pulled over onto the shoulder. I jogged up to the passenger side, heart pounding from a mix of relief and nerves, and climbed in. The man behind the wheel was American, not Canadian. He was older, rough around the edges, with the look of someone who had spent too many years on the road. His eyes had this strange energy, darting from the road to me and back again. He barely let me settle into my seat before he started talking. At first, it was just rambling. He had a lot to say, and I got the sense he didn't get many chances to talk. I was his audience, and he had a performance ready. He went on about his life, people who had wronged him, people who had pissed him off. He had stories of grudges that had lasted years, and he spoke about them like they had happened yesterday. His voice had this strange intensity, like each word was a spark to an unseen fire. Then, somewhere in the middle of all his talking, he told me he had shot a guy once. Just dropped it into the conversation like it was nothing. A man had been harassing his mother, and he got so mad that he shot him. Not dead, just wounded, but he spoke about it like he wasn't entirely sure if he regretted not finishing the job. I kept my mouth shut. I nodded along, letting him keep talking. Then, the subject changed. He started talking about his kids. At first, he spoke about them warmly, with real love in his voice. Then, just as quickly, his tone would shift. He would talk about how angry he'd be if anyone messed with them, how he wouldn't hesitate to protect them. Then, without warning, he turned his head completely to face me, locking eyes with me while still driving at highway speed. "I'll fucking kill anyone who messes with my kids." His voice exploded in the small space of the cab. He didn't look back at the road. He just stared at me, like he needed me to understand just how serious he was. The truck rolled forward, steady, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, but his eyes locked onto mine. I was frozen for a moment. My heart pounded. He wasn't just making a point, he was making sure I felt it. The way he looked at me, it was like he was seeing something in me, something that made him want to push this moment as far as he could. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I forced myself to act. I told him to pull over. He didn't respond at first, like he hadn't heard me, like he was too lost in whatever moment he had created in his own head. I repeated myself, louder this time. Finally, he slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder. I climbed out fast, barely getting a thanks, out before slamming the door shut behind me. I heard the engine rev as he pulled back onto the road, leaving me alone on the side of the highway. The night felt even darker than before. The road stretched on endlessly, and there wasn't a single light in sight. My adrenaline was still pumping, but I was suddenly very, very tired. I found a ditch off the side of the road, curled up in my jacket, and tried to sleep. I don't know how long I lay there, half awake, the cold creeping in, when I saw another set of headlights approaching. I sat up, squinting as they slowed down. Another truck pulled over, and an older man climbed down from the cab. He had a thick southern accent, one so heavy I could barely understand him, but his face was kind. He asked me where I was headed, his voice full of genuine concern. He told me I'd freeze if I stayed out there much longer, and he all but begged me to ride with him so I wouldn't have to spend the night in a ditch. I hesitated. My last ride had nearly scared the life out of me. But something in this man's voice, the way he looked at me, made me believe he wasn't like the last guy. I climbed into his truck, still shaken, but grateful. He spent the rest of the ride telling me about his grandchildren. He was full of stories about them, how proud he was, how much he missed them when he was on the road. His voice was warm, and for the first time that night, I felt safe. He took me all the way to North Bay, and when I finally climbed out of his truck, I felt like I had been given a second chance. I never hitchhiked again. I had done this route before, but never this late. Driving down the Baja Peninsula was something I was used to, but this time was different. I had gotten a late start from Los Angeles, leaving around 5 p.m., which was already a mistake. By the time I crossed into Mexico at Tijuana, it was well past dark, and by the time I was in the countryside, it was after 9 p.m. The roads were slower than I remembered, and my GPS was useless half the time. I was supposed to be heading to a small town south of Ensenada to drop off a package. Nothing illegal, just a delivery, but none of that would matter if I ran into trouble. I was tired, the road ahead of me was dark, and I started to feel the weight of the situation. I was alone, deep in unfamiliar territory, with no real backup if something went wrong. The highway was nearly empty. Occasionally, I would pass an old truck loaded down with goods, or a car packed with people. But for the most part, it was just me and the road. The stars overhead were bright, and the night was quiet aside from the low hum of my engine. Every once in a while, I would see the outline of a house in the distance, or the glow of a small village far off the highway, but there were long stretches of absolute nothingness. As I drove, I kept looking at my fuel gauge, making sure I had enough to get where I was going. Gas stations were few and far between, and I wasn't about to get stranded out here. I was also keeping an eye on my surroundings. The roads were rough, winding, and in some areas, completely unmarked. It would be easy to get lost, and I was already starting to feel like I had made a wrong turn somewhere. The road signs weren't helping much, and my gut was telling me I was off track. Then, up ahead, I saw lights. At first, I thought it was a town, but as I got closer, I realized what it was: a military checkpoint. Federals. This was the middle of nowhere, well past midnight, and I was coming up on a fully manned checkpoint in the darkness. They had jeeps lined up, some with mounted machine guns. Bright lights were shining in all directions, cutting through the night. And then there were the dogs, pacing back and forth, handlers standing beside them, rifles in hand. I had no choice but to slow down. There was no way around it. Even if I wanted to turn back, they would see me. Running would only make things worse. My heart started pounding as I rolled up to the checkpoint, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. As soon as I came to a stop, a soldier approached my driver's side window, rifle raised. I could see his face clearly in the lights. He was young, probably no older than 20, if that. He stared at me, eyes sharp, mouth set in a hard line. I didn't understand Spanish beyond a few basic words, but I knew enough to recognize when someone was questioning me. He motioned for me to step out of the truck. I hesitated, but I knew I had no choice. Slowly, I opened the door and climbed down, keeping my hands where they could see them. The moment my feet hit the ground, 2 more soldiers came up. One of them had a flashlight and started scanning over me, over my truck, while another ordered the dogs forward. The animals sniffed around the tires, the doors, the back of the truck. One of them jumped up against the side, paws scratching at the metal. I kept my breathing steady, trying not to look nervous. The soldier in front of me said something. I caught one word, "Donde?" Where? He was asking where I was going. I told him the name of the town, trying to pronounce it as clearly as I could. I told him I was making a delivery, trying to keep my voice even. He just stared at me, repeating the town's name slowly, like he didn't believe me. Behind him, his men were poking around the truck, shining lights into the cab, looking under the seats, checking the back. The dogs were still sniffing aggressively. The whole time, the guns never lowered. I knew I was at their mercy. If they decided I was a problem, there was nothing I could do. They could have taken me, locked me up, and no one would have ever known what happened to me. The minutes dragged on. The soldiers kept searching. I stood there, barely moving, barely breathing, waiting. Then, finally, the lead soldier lowered his gun. He said something to his men, motioned toward my truck. They backed off one by one. The dogs were pulled away. The lights shining into my cab turned away. It was over. He waved me back toward my truck. I didn't hesitate. I climbed in, hands still a little unsteady as I reached for the wheel. As soon as they stepped back, I pulled forward, slowly at first, then picking up speed as I got past the checkpoint. My eyes flicked to the mirrors. The soldiers were already turning their attention elsewhere. The lights of the checkpoint grew smaller behind me, fading into the night. I didn't breathe fully until they were completely out of sight. I kept driving, not stopping, not slowing down, just putting as much distance between me and that checkpoint as I could. The road ahead was still dark, still empty, still just as dangerous as before, but at least I was still moving. At least I was still in control. It wasn't until I reached my destination, hours later, that I finally let myself relax. I made the drop, got back in my truck, and started heading north again. The whole drive back, I kept thinking about those soldiers, about the way they looked at me, about the way that kid held his gun steady, like he had done it 100 times before. That checkpoint could have gone a lot of ways. I got lucky. I never took that route again after dark. I've been a truck driver for nearly 15 years, and in that time, I've seen just about everything the road has to offer. Stunning landscapes, terrifying accidents, restless nights on endless highways. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night on Route 87 in Arizona. It was late, maybe just past 2 in the morning, when I found myself driving down a particularly isolated stretch of highway. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of the road, vast and lifeless under a sky so dark it felt like I was the only soul left in existence. The nearest town had been over an hour back, and the next one was at least 50 miles ahead. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, you start to feel disconnected from the world. The hum of the truck's engine, the occasional flickering of my dashboard lights, the dull glow of the instrument panel. All of it felt distant, like I was drifting through space rather than cutting across the Arizona desert. I was exhausted, but I couldn't afford to stop. The schedule was tight, and my last break had been a quick one at a tiny gas station that barely had a working restroom. My thermos was empty, my eyes were dry from staring at the road for so long, and the only thing keeping me awake was a gnawing sense of unease I couldn't quite place. Then I saw him. A lone hitchhiker stood by the side of the road, his thumb extended, motionless as a statue. My headlights barely reached him at first, but as I got closer, I could make out more details. He was tall, dressed in an old flannel shirt and worn-out jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't moving, wasn't reacting to my approaching truck, just standing there like he'd been there forever, waiting for someone to notice him. Something about him sent a chill through me. Maybe it was the way he was so eerily still, or maybe it was the fact that there was no car in sight. I hadn't passed any wrecks, no broken-down vehicles, nothing to indicate how he had gotten all the way out here. Normally, I wouldn't pick up hitchhikers. Company policy strictly discouraged it, and besides, you never know what kind of trouble you might be inviting into your cab. But something about this guy, something made me hesitate. I took my foot off the accelerator slightly, considering it. Maybe he was stranded, maybe he'd gotten lost and walked for miles in the desert heat, and now he was desperate for a ride. Then he vanished. Just gone. One moment he was there, standing perfectly still, his thumb outstretched, and the next, my headlights passed over an empty patch of road. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the flickering of my lights had played a trick on me. But I knew what I saw. I didn't slow down. If anything, I pressed harder on the gas, my pulse hammering in my ears. The desert outside my window seemed darker now, more menacing. I reached for my radio, thinking about checking in with another driver, maybe just to hear another human voice, but something told me not to. A few miles passed. My grip on the wheel relaxed just a little, enough for me to take a breath. Maybe I was just too tired. Long hours on the road, exhaustion setting in. It wouldn't be the first time I'd seen something weird while driving late at night. Then I saw him again. A quarter mile ahead, standing in the same position on the side of the road. Same flannel shirt. Same jeans. Same lifeless posture. I felt ice crawl up my spine. There was no way, he could have gotten ahead of me. I'd been driving at nearly 70 miles per hour, and the land was flat, open desert. I would have seen him move, would have passed him running full speed. And yet there he was. I did the only thing I could think of. I didn't stop. As I approached, I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, locked onto the dark ribbon of highway ahead. I gripped the wheel so tightly my fingers ached, every muscle in my body tense. The moment my headlights illuminated him again, I saw something that made my stomach drop. He was looking right at me. Before, he had been motionless, staring straight ahead. Now his head was turned, his face completely visible in the glow of my high beams. And he was grinning. Not a normal grin. Not the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who just found a ride. It was too wide, too unnatural. My vision tunneled. My heart was a hammer in my chest. I blew past him, gripping the wheel like a lifeline. In my side mirror, I caught a final glimpse of him, standing in the red glow of my taillights. Still smiling. I didn't look back again. For the next 20 miles, I felt like something was in the truck with me. The air was thick, suffocating. I kept expecting to see movement in my passenger seat, to hear breathing that wasn't mine, to feel fingers brushing against my arm. I turned the radio on just to drown out the silence. Finally, I reached a truck stop. It was nothing fancy, just a small diner attached to a fueling station. But at that moment, it was the most welcoming sight in the world. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long moment, my hands still trembling. Inside, I found a few other truckers sitting at the counter, nursing coffee and talking in low voices. I must have looked shaken, because the guy closest to me, a bearded man in his 50s, gave me a once-over and said, "Long night?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "You ever see something weird out on Route 87? The guy's expression darkened. Across the counter, the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stopped wiping down a table and turned to listen. The trucker sighed, took a sip of his coffee, and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I stared. "What do you mean?" Another trucker chimed in, shaking his head. "The hitchhiker. People have been seeing him for years. Always late at night, always the same stretch of road." I felt cold all over. "Who is he?" The bearded man shrugged. "No one knows. Some say he was a drifter who got killed out there a long time ago. Others say he was never real to begin with. But the thing is," he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, "nobody ever picks him up." I frowned. "Why not?" He gave me a grim look. "Because the few that did were never seen again." A heavy silence settled over the diner. I didn't know what to say, and frankly, I didn't want to know any more. I finished my coffee in silence, paid my bill, and got back in my truck. I still had hours left to drive. But no matter how tired I got, no matter how much my eyes burned from exhaustion, I never stopped again on that road. I had been on the road for nearly 14 hours when exhaustion started to set in. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, cutting through the empty expanse of the Midwest. My eyes burned from staring at the road, and I knew I was pushing my limits. The nearest truck stop was over an hour away, and I didn't want to risk dozing off behind the wheel. I checked the GPS for the next rest area and saw one coming up in about 10 miles. Not ideal, but it would have to do. The road was mostly deserted, just the occasional set of headlights appearing in my mirrors before fading into the distance. A few scattered farmhouses sat in the distance, their windows glowing faintly under the moonlight. The sky was clear, the kind of quiet, peaceful night truckers usually love. But something about this stretch of road unsettled me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I flipped on the CB radio, hoping for some chatter, but all I got was static and the occasional broken transmission from another trucker too far away to hear clearly. The loneliness of the road crept in. When I finally spotted the sign for the rest area, I breathed a sigh of relief. Just a couple of hours of sleep, and I'd be good to go. The rest area was small. Just a single row of parking spaces, a couple of vending machines, and a dimly lit restroom building. There were only 2 other trucks parked here, their cabins dark, their drivers likely asleep. I pulled in, shifting into park with a sigh. I locked the doors, a habit more than anything else, and cracked the windows just a little for ventilation. It was a warm night, but not uncomfortably so. The hum of the engine died down, leaving behind an eerie silence. I leaned my seat back, closing my eyes. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant roar of an engine on the highway. I wasn't worried about anything. I had done this 1,000 times before. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. Something had moved the truck. It was subtle, just a gentle shift, like someone had climbed onto the back. I held my breath, listening. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe a gust of wind. But then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible creak from the trailer. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced at the side mirrors, but in the darkness, I couldn't see much. My mind raced. Could be an animal. Could be a homeless person looking for a place to sleep. Or it could be something worse. I reached under my seat, gripping the metal baseball bat I always kept for protection. Taking a deep breath, I flipped on the cabin lights, hoping the sudden brightness would scare off whatever, or whoever, was outside. Silence. No movement. No retreating footsteps. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just my paranoia. But just as I started to relax, I heard it again. A soft thud. From inside the trailer. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. The trailer was locked. I knew that for a fact. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. Unless... No, I didn't want to go there. Gripping my bat tighter, I took a deep breath and climbed down from the cab. The cool night air sent a shiver through me, but it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling. The air felt heavy, stagnant. I moved slowly toward the back of the truck, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The 2 other trucks in the lot were still dark and silent. No sign of movement. I hesitated before unlocking the trailer. If someone was inside, I was about to be face to face with them. I braced myself, then swung the door open. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cargo inside. Everything looked normal. No boxes were disturbed. No sign of forced entry. And yet, right there, near the center of the trailer, was a single wet footprint. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from the rain. I hadn't driven through any. It was just there, a single footprint leading nowhere. My mouth went dry. I scanned the interior again, my flashlight trembling slightly. The cargo was undisturbed. The locks hadn't been broken. And yet, something had been in here. Or worse, something still was. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained inside the trailer. My gut screamed at me to close the door and drive the hell out of there. But then I heard it. A whisper. So faint I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. I froze. The sound hadn't come from inside the trailer. It had come from above it. My breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Slowly, ever so slowly, I tilted my flashlight upward, tracing the edge of the trailer's roof. Nothing. The night was still, the stars indifferent to my growing panic. and then a scraping sound. Right above me. That was it. I slammed the trailer door shut, locking it as fast as my shaking hands allowed. I ran back to the cab, threw the truck into gear, and tore out of that rest stop like the devil himself was chasing me. I checked my mirrors frantically, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop miles away. I pulled into a parking space near other trucks, somewhere I wouldn't be alone. My heart was still hammering. I stepped out, walking to the back of my truck again, just to check. Everything seemed normal. The locks were secure. No new footprints. No signs of tampering. But as I turned to go back to the cab, my eyes caught something on the side of the trailer. A single, smudged handprint. Not just any handprint, it was upside down, as if someone had been clinging to the roof. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even turn off the engine. I just sat there, gripping my bat, waiting for daylight. I never stopped at that rest area again. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years. In that time, I've seen some things, some weird, some tragic, some downright terrifying. But there's one night that still haunts me. A night I try not to think about when I'm alone in my cab, barreling down some empty stretch of highway. A night when I saw something I still can't explain. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was making a night run through rural Louisiana. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin even though the AC was blasting in my cab. The highway was nearly deserted, just a long stretch of blacktop cutting through dense swampland, the occasional flicker of headlights appearing in the distance before disappearing just as quickly. I had the radio on low, more for company than entertainment. The monotony of the road had me in a trance-like state, eyes on the lanes, hands on the wheel, mind wandering between exhaustion and focus. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of my running lights. But as I glanced at my side mirror, I realized something was clinging to the side of my trailer. A dark shape, low and hunched, barely visible against the metal. My pulse spiked. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was overtired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. I gripped the wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal. Maybe a deer or a large dog had jumped up and gotten stuck. But that didn't make sense. There was no impact, no jolt, nothing that would indicate something had hitched a ride on my truck. Whatever it was holding on. I kept my speed steady, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't shift in the wind the way I expected it to. It was just there, dark and unmoving, like a shadow pressed against the side of my truck. My gut twisted. I'd heard stories before, truckers picking up unwanted passengers, things that weren't supposed to be there. Most were just myths, the kind of tall tales truck stop regulars swapped over bad coffee. But this was real, and I had no idea what to do. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just some desperate hitchhiker, someone who had climbed onto my trailer back at a stop, trying to hitch a free ride. But that explanation didn't sit right. There hadn't been anyone around when I last fueled up, and even if there had been, how would they have climbed on without me noticing? I decided to speed up, hoping the wind would force whatever it was to let go. I pressed the pedal, feeling the engine respond beneath me as I pushed past 70. The road blurred in front of me, the trees on either side melting into the darkness. I risked another glance at the mirror. It was still there. My stomach clenched. What the hell? I needed to pull over. I needed to stop and see what the hell was on my truck. But the thought of stepping outside, of being alone in the dark with it, sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. No, stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. I reached for my radio, flicking to an open channel. Any drivers out here on Highway 165? I got something weird going on. Silence. I tried again, my voice tight. Anyone out here? Seeing anything strange tonight? Nothing but static. I cursed under my breath. The radio wasn't dead, but no one else was listening. I was alone out here. Just me, and whatever was clinging to my truck. Then, for the first time, it moved. A slow shift, like something adjusting its grip. My stomach dropped. My fingers tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. My breathing was too loud in the cab, ragged and uneven. I had to get rid of it. Now, there was a gas station up ahead, a small, rundown place I'd stopped at before. It wasn't much, just a single row of pumps and a convenience store with flickering neon lights. But it was bright, and right now bright felt safe. I signaled, pulling onto the exit ramp. The moment I slowed down, I felt it, a new weight, shifting on my truck, like something crawling toward the cab. My skin crawled. I fought the urge to slam the brakes. Instead, I coasted into the gas station lot, pulling into the brightest spot I could find. The place was empty, save for a single car parked near the store entrance. The attendant inside barely glanced up as I rolled in. I killed the engine, gripping the wheel for a long moment, gathering my nerve. Then, slowly, I reached for my flashlight. My hand was shaking. I didn't want to get out. Every instinct was screaming at me to just drive, to get the hell out of there and never look back. But I had to see. I had to know. Swallowing hard, I pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement. The night air was thick, hot, buzzing with unseen insects. My boots crunched on gravel as I rounded the cab, flashlight in hand. I hesitated before pointing the beam at the trailer. My stomach was a knot of dread. Then, finally, I shined the light. Nothing. The side of the trailer was clean, untouched. No marks, no handprints, no signs that anything had been there at all. I exhaled shakily, a laugh bubbling up from my throat. Had I imagined it? Had I let exhaustion get the better of me? But then, I saw them, on the passenger side door. Handprints, smudged and wet, like something had been pressing its palms against the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The prints were long, fingers stretched impossibly far, as if whatever made them wasn't quite human. A rustling sound behind me sent a jolt of terror through my body. I whipped around, flashlight swinging wildly. The darkness beyond the gas station seemed deeper now, like something was watching from just beyond the reach of the lights. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I turned, yanking the cab door open and scrambling inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot without looking back. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was just exhaustion, a trick of the mind. Maybe it was something else. All I know is, I never take that route alone at night anymore. And I never, ever, check my side mirrors after dark.